Hello, and welcome to Garden Puerto Rico. For us, it's a true privilege to be part of Ars Electronica this year, and we would like to thank you for joining us today. My name is Shirley, and I will be your hostess throughout this webinar series. For the next few days, you will be hearing from scholars, researchers, academics, and entrepreneurs on how exactly they're applying digital technologies for the benefit of culture and humankind. Today, the webinar program is titled Digital Innovation in Cultural Heritage and Art Studies, documenting the intangible, heritage preservation in an attempt of making sense. This webinar series presents different documentation approaches and methods that apply digital technologies for cultural heritage conservation and preservation. Today's webinars are looking super interesting. First off, we have Ms. Alitza Cardona Collazo's webinar, which explores the future of heritage in Puerto Rico. Alitza will be discussing part of her research in essentially preserving the memory of a building that no longer exists, namely the Federal Penitentiary Building, Oso Blanco. Our second speaker of the day, Dr. Irene Esteves, will be introducing us to the method for documenting vital information from artists or the main source while they're still available. Her webinar showcases her project Pedal, a contemporary art conservation initiative with a crucial digital component. So definitely stay tuned for that. Our third webinar by Dr. Antonio Martinez focuses on the Oyer Project website. Dr. Martinez is a physicist. He's a professor at the University of Puerto Rico, and his webinar promises to be very, very interesting. But without further delay, allow me to introduce to you our first speaker of the day, Alitza Cardona Collazo. Alitza is an anthropologist, historian, an architecture designer, and museum professional. She currently works as a cultural heritage specialist at the Puerto Rico Science, Technology, and Research Trust. Her research focuses on human-space relations and transformation through theoretical interpretation of the cultural heritage, specializing on the analysis and development of intangible heritage. Alitza is also my colleague at the Cultural Heritage Innovation Program. She's someone who I admire deeply. So I'm really, really excited and looking forward for her webinar. Alitza, please, whenever you're ready, the stage is all yours.
Okay, thank you for the introduction. So yeah, I'm gonna talk about space. I'm gonna talk about language. I'm gonna talk about Oso Blanco. Oso Blanco is a very interesting case about a building that does not physically exist in its entirety. It's just it just remains one part. What just remained is one part, one aspect of the whole building that once existed. And we're going to be talking about how we think with heritage. In a world that is changing, that its population is growing, we need to think about heritage. I mean, we need to think with heritage. And what I mean about that is what are we going to be transferring to our future generations? So Puerto Rico is an island, and it's a really small island. So we do not have a lot of space to be building. And it is not possible to preserve the totality of significant spaces. How we conceive space has a lot to do with how we speak space into being, how we talk about space, how we talk about ourselves. And throughout history, we have been making questions. The first questions humans asked in history, in what is recorded history, is what is nature? What is outside of our bodies? And how it impacts our bodies. And then after Socrates, we started to talk about how our bodies, how we as humans intervene in that nature and how it impacts space. When we talk about space, we talk about movement, about time, about temporality, about things coming into being, about things evolving. And in Nicomachean Ethics, from Aristotle, he talks about how everything we do, how everything we say has an impact in how we shape our perception, in how we shape how we look at space and how we feel time. So needless to say, perception has a lot to do with how we signify ourselves within that space. So after questioning our bodies, we question what are we doing in that space, and then comes all these meanings and perception about faith, about what are we doing here, why are we are here, why are we existing the way we are existing. Then we come to question, after St. Augustine, how we are shaping our space throughout faith, throughout what we believe in those spaces, how it comes into being. And then there is a time in history where not only we question how we are being, but we're questioning realities, and we're questioning if perception is the same for every human, or is just something very particular to one human that is living an experience and another that is living another experience. And then then after we acknowledge the power of technology, or what I am going to call in this presentation extension systems, our perception broadens, the capability of diffusion broadens. And then we are here. We are in what in philosophy is called transhumanism. Now we are introducing not only the virtual space, but we're introducing machines to impact the way how humans not only perceive environments, but how we communicate and how we efficiently develop our own environments. This presentation, it's going to start talking about communication, because culture is essentially a way of communicating not only needs, but how we understand certain phenomena that impacts and shapes our context. So yeah, we're going to start. I'm going to show my presentation. There it is. My presentation is called Oso Blanco, an experimental space for conservation based on innovation for education and the bequest of heritage. So to start off this presentation, there is a really interesting part in the Bible that talks about the Tower of Babylon. I think it's Genesis 11. And it's really interesting because shaping space starts with language. We talk into existence not only our perception, but our needs. We build from what we communicate or what we are able to communicate. We traduce or translate into space our needs, our perceptions of phenomena in space. And it has an orientation, it has direction, it has intentionality. So being part of a narrative in that sense, so when space comes into being, and in that case about the Tower of Babylon, when we're given different languages, we're given different needs and different manners of communicating that needs, that perception of our developing space. And in that sense, innovation has to mean something. When we employ any strategy of innovation, it has to be capable of developing in itself a sense of relationality, a sense of identity towards that strategy of innovation. Innovation can evolve, it can't adapt in a group, and it can't become a cultural practice if it does not mean something in that group. If people cannot identify or cannot relate to any strategy of innovation, it's very difficult that it will be adapted in certain groups or certain cultural practices. So this is the structure of my presentation. In this presentation, as we're doing now, we're talking about culture, we're talking about communication, semiology, and proxemics, the preservation of the intangible, in this case, knowledge about something having existed and continuing to exist, but in a transformed way. So we're talking about preserving cultural practices, body without body, space, place, orientation, positionality, space and place isn't the same. Oso Blanco as a reflection of society. And this whole presentation has a main reference, and it's the white paper number 2 for the Puerto Rico Science, Technology, and Research Trust. It's called Oso Blanco, an experimental space for the conservation of the collection items from the 20th century state penitentiary in Puerto Rico, the future of heritage, and references. So starting off, talking about culture, this is the definition I'm employing towards the development of this presentation, and it's in Spanish and in English. It's in Spanish because it was originally written in Spanish in Gilberto Jimenez's book. You're gonna see the references at the end. So in English, culture is the social organization of sense internalized by subjects and objectified in symbolic forms. All of this in historically specific and socially structural context. And this is what I was talking about innovation. In strategies that construct innovative ways of developing actions or developing technology need to be embedded in socially structured context, but because at the end, everything is a correspondence of symbols and signifiers. So culture for me is not only about cultural practices, it's about a process. So in that sense, not every cultural practice is, I think, in a way deserving of being preserved into the future, because not all cultural practices are efficient towards the environment, towards others, towards broad considerations of how we exchange information or how humanity develops. And culture can be identified not only as a process, but yes, in a determined moment. Cultural practices can be identified in a determined moment. So in this sense, where we are talking about language or linguistics, we're talking about processes that are diachronic, that are organized in a structured way. In this sense, we're talking about yesterday, today, tomorrow, 100 years from now, and in a synchronic way. And when we're talking about in a synchronic manner, we're talking about the transversality of the effects of every cultural practice or everything that develops within time. So in that sense, we're talking about like cultural identities or Pierre Bourdieu's habitus. Cultural practices are adopted by habit. Cultural practices are developed within many rituals and many correspondences of signifiers. So continuing with this, when we're talking about communication, we're talking about metalinguistic awareness. What is metalinguistic awareness? Metalinguistic awareness is how we are communicating. Does the other person, the one receiving the message, understand the codes, understand the way of that codes are interpreted and are translated into social groups and how they're exchanged? And this is the thing about culture. Culture is a group of codes. As it is communication, it can be transferred, and it has to have a sense of production. Logically, everything comes from something, or is a production of the needs of something, or our perception of needs towards something. And in that sense, well, social representation is a significant organization of reality, and it has two ways of manifesting itself through objectification or anchorage. Objectification is the creation from something, and anchorage is the creation from something that is known. We can create something that people not necessarily recognize, but we can create also from something that a lot of people can recognize and thus innovate from that. Yeah, as I was saying earlier, signification and communication problems reside in social codes, sense of production, and interpretation. So when talking about semiology or proxemics, I'm using a lot of people, but for this presentation, I concentrated in, I think, thinkers that are are efficient in the way they're communicating, how things evolve in terms of not only proxemics, but semiology. And Umberto Eco takes a lot from Charles Peirce in the way he communicates about semiology, but Umberto Eco says that, well, semiotics is the result of the world's humanization through or from culture. Within culture, every entity becomes a semiotic phenomenon, and communications law are culture's law. Like I was saying at the beginning of the presentation, everything signifies. And when we're talking about culture, we're talking about how things come into being, not only as a symbol, but as a significance. And well, you're gonna see that when I am talking about each thinker, there is a embedded communication with it. So verb being is, well, culture is indispensable to decipher social dynamics. And Tolkien and Parsons said that energy and material resources are what condition action, but culture is what controls and orients it. It is because of this, culture is essential for the comprehension of behavioral determinants and social practices. Innovation needs to be embedded in those social practices. I mean, you cannot, I mean, you can, but it's unlikely that whatever strategy from innovation or technology, it's gonna survive is process of adaptation if a lot of people does not understand it. And it has to represent a collective, not only one social group. When we're talking about culture, if more people are represented by those practices, it's gonna survive for a long period of time. I mean, well, in the same sense, architecture, art, regardless of their ever-changing and interesting universes of discourse, traditionally fulfill the task of providing and embodying metaphysics for society. When we see landscape, or we see the urban landscape from that matter, we're seeing an ideogram of needs. We're seeing a conversation of needs, not only from one group, but from many groups that are constitutive of society. So there's an array of needs, of concerns, of perceptions that are constitutive of how we build our world or how we build our realities. And every single part of a city, a place, is going to be representative of an aspect of a group or a part of us, of that society. So then it becomes a space, or it becomes a place. And well, Yifu Tuan, I think that's how it is pronounced, talks about space and place. Space as a probability of becoming is as a probability of movement. Place is that space that is signifying. The moment you see an object and recognize an object in a space, it becomes a place because it means to you, or its meaning. It is a process. Again, it's meaning. Not every place is significant, but places are going to be meaningful if you recognize it. So if we look for fundamental principles of spatial organization, we're going to find them in two kinds of fact: the posture and structure of the human body, and the relation, whether close or distance, between human beings. Man, out of his intimate experience with his body and with other people, organizes space so that it conforms and caters to his biological needs and social relations. So that's what we're talking about. Places might cease to exist, but if it was long enough, and if it meant for long enough, it's gonna become a symbolic asset. A symbolic asset. I mean, I don't know if this is written anywhere, but in various presentations, I have talked about symbolic assets. And symbolic assets for me is those places that have been long enough to mean in a place and that can be recognized from a collective. And when it ceases to exist, it becomes a point of reference for many people that have lived during the moment it was meaningful. So, for example, if you're talking about the Pink House, and the Pink House was meaningful for a community and ceases to exist, you're going to be saying, well, that was where the Pink House was. I live 2 blocks from where the Pink House was. So even if it doesn't exist, the fact that you're using it as a point of reference, even if it doesn't exist, it means something. So yeah, now we're going to be talking about Oso Blanco. Oso Blanco is just that. For me, it's a symbolic asset. Oso Blanco is, even if it doesn't exist, when we're talking about, for example, the Puerto Rico Science, Technology, and Research Trust, you say, well, I'm working where it was the state penitentiary of Oso Blanco. And if you see here, it talks to us about Oso Blanco having an evolution in its name. It first was called the Insular Penitentiary of Puerto Rico, and then was called the State Penitentiary of Puerto Rico. And as you keep reading about it, you're gonna see that this building not only was a place of discipline, in many ways a reflection of society's needs, but we're gonna see a political evolution inside of it. It first was called insular, and then it was called state. So when we become an autonomous territory from the United States, we're not a state, but we came sort of, we're using that name as a state penitentiary of Puerto Rico after 1952, more or less. So yeah, so Oso Blanco is called Oso Blanco because if you see Beatriz del Cueto's history of hydraulic mortars, we see that the main material had a white bear in its packaging. The concrete that was brought to Puerto Rico came from the northern part of Europe, the Netherlands, and had that white bear, Oso Blanco. So that's how the name comes into being. I'm gonna read this really fast because it's important to understand some facts about this structure. So first, the Insular Penitentiary of Puerto Rico, locally known as Oso Blanco, is part of a broad urban plan created during the first half of the 20th century by the American civil government. This institution is recognized as an individual component within a chain of institutions created for civil welfare. Until 1926, when the state penitentiary project was designed, Puerto Rico had only one space created to implement reclusion as a punishment for crime against the law, society, and other individuals. The old Spanish penitentiary La Princesa, located in San Juan and built in 1833, had a major hygiene and overcrowding issue. And this is something you're going to see throughout the history of Oso Blanco, hygiene, overcrowding issues. It becomes, as I was saying, a reflection of the needs of society in that moment and at a later time. It really is an increasing problem in the development of the Puerto Rican history, the fact about problems towards health, towards education, and many other public health issues. So continuing. The structure of a new penitentiary will be assessing the result issues derived from our population and obsolete design strategies. The modern architecture employed in the Puerto Rico State Penitentiary design will serve to represent and communicate the new social, cultural, economic, political, and public health paradigms that will lead economic growth and development in the 20th century. Puerto Rico has its first electric service structure developed from 1937 to more or less 1950s. And so in more or less 20 years, 15 years, we had all our energy and electrical service constructed. So I guess that is one big part of this building and many other buildings that were built towards shaping this new society. Francisco Roldan used in its design a mix of Art Deco and Spanish Revival architectural styles. And after 70 years of existence, the State Penitentiary will be nominated for the National Register of Historic Places. The main building of Oso Blanco was subsequently recognized as a historical structure in March of 2003. Oso Blanco was designed from 1926, but it was inaugurated in 1933. So what it meant for this, it was not only the way we punish, I mean, the government or the political structure punish people for crimes, but it was also a way of validating the sense of production. You're gonna see throughout Oso Blanco history that the way crimes are punished, or what we consider to be crime, they're going to be evolving in the same or in a corresponding manner of how economy shapes society, or how development shapes society. And you're going to see that at first inmates were brought to the penitentiary of Oso Blanco because they were stealing food or stealing crops, or well, things like that. And at first adults had the same punishment as kids of 14 years old that they were imprisoned in this penitentiary. So in many ways, it is like a reflection of what was happening in society, how people was educated to perceive necessity, to go about their needs. The Puerto Rico Science, Technology, and Research Trust is a private nonprofit entity created under Law 214 of August 18, 2004 to promote and facilitate innovation, research, and technology. During 2007, the Puerto Rico Science, Technology, and Research Trust acquires the Oso Blanco State Penitentiary lands from the Department of Transport and Public Works. Considering the historic importance of the main building of Oso Blanco, careful and professional examination of this historical structure was undertaken. The building was proven hazardous for it underwent demolition in 2015. The fact that there was a professional examination towards its conservation is really important, because we have to question, is every historical building deserving of being part of a preservation plan? I mean, sometimes construction or technology that is developed during the production of a building does not necessarily assume the realities, the economic realities or the environmental realities in a social political context. I mean, in Puerto Rico, we have been in an economic crisis, I guess, all of our history. Economic crises can be acknowledged since the 17th century. So we see that it is really important when we are developing heritage, or when we are ascribing to heritage certain building or certain practices, that they are constitutive also of the evolutionary probabilities of that society. They are economic realities to assume. They are social practices that become realities that are deserving of being assumed in many historical and heritage correspondences. So talking about that, when we're talking about the preservation of the intangible, we're not only talking about building, we're talking about practices. We're not only talking about what we can touch or what we can see, we're talking about what we can acknowledge or what we can perceive. And Oso Blanco was a challenge. And what I had and what I did not have. Well, I did not have plans. I didn't have any construction plans of Oso Blanco. Oso Blanco didn't exist. And when I'm talking about this, it didn't exist physically. The material aspect of Oso Blanco doesn't exist. We have no historical structure, as I was saying, and no significant authentic documentation regarding building operations. And this is very important to know, because Puerto Rico has been part of cascading effects, talking about not only Hurricane Maria. We have certain economic deficiency. We're talking about political crisis. We're talking about many things that not only are shaping this transitional process of Puerto Rico, not only as Puerto Rico, but as Puerto Rico in a also globalization process. When I went looking for any documentation that could help me begin to build a conservation plan, there wasn't any. There wasn't any documentation about the history of Oso Blanco as it was operating. Papers were not found. So it was starting essentially from scratch. And what I did have the collection pieces. When Oso Blanco went for demolition, some historical pieces were salvaged from the demolition process. And this is really important when talking about the Preservation Act. So if you, in this case, the collection pieces of Oso Blanco not only are composed of certain components regarding the interior of the structure. We're talking about the portico. That's a big emblematic part of the structure, because the only thing that it was registered was the first building, the one that was constructed in 1926 till 1933. I haven't say this until now, but one significant aspect about the construction of Oso Blanco is that it was halted because of Hurricane San Felipe, of how it is known as Hurricane Okeechobee. So at first it had some components in its development that they were not there after that period when construction was halted. So yeah, so I had historic information like the one I told you now, and I had historic information from secondary sources like newspapers, like some people that have written things in web pages. I also interviewed some people that had relations to Oso Blanco. They worked there, or they had family being having been in Oso Blanco as an inmate. So yeah, I have a lot of secondary information, secondary source information. I have the law. And the fact that when the law in Puerto Rico is talking about preservation, it talks about preservation in different spheres, and it's not very coherent in the use of language. So present preservation became a very, very powerful topic at the beginning of the 20th century when the United States implemented its military government. So the first groups to help preserve some not only cultural practices but buildings and objects and things that pertain to the historical development of Puerto Rico was the Junta de Planificación de Puerto Rico. It had a group, and it began to shape what historical preservation is in Puerto Rico. Then historic preservation is developed in, like I said, three spheres, with its very distinct use of language towards what we are calling preservation. So we have the local municipality government, the state government, and the federal government. And of course, the federal government being the spheres with most impact. We have the National Historic Preservation Act of the 1966. And documentation that is evidencing this development of language, of how we are perceiving preservation or conservation practices, is very important, because you're not only gonna see that there is a difference in how time and space and even representation is conceived, but you're gonna see that the impact of its people is differentiated between the uses of conservation practices. Local government can trace the importance of a site from many generations, whereas when we're employing the Preservation Act, it does not necessarily act in that way. The Preservation Act goes through interviews from local residents and the community, but not necessarily takes into consideration a length aspect of, or a historically length aspect of not only historical significance or integrity, we're going to see that topic, but the impact in that community's environment. And we're not talking about the whole ecology, but how the environmental and sociological aspects are intertwined in a correspondence of symbols, significance, and meanings. And we're here. So when I approached the white paper number 2, when making the conservation plan, one of my fields of studies in museum studies, and my first references, having studied phenomenology and proxemics in 2012 by my architecture professor Elio Martínez Joffre, I began to elaborate this thesis that is called Análisis de Criterios Estéticos y Discursivos en el Proceso de Conceptualización, Diseño y Montaje de Exposiciones. And I started that thesis with a 500-page long thesis about how we are introducing intentionality to space, and thus generating a concept derived of different discourses represented not only in the process, but in the ways it can grow, it can develop for the future. So in that sense, my mentors for developing that theory were architects Elio Martínez Joffre, Mrs. Evelyn Figueroa, and architect Edwin Quiles, that they're very notable architects here in Puerto Rico, and they not only use their knowledge about proxemics, about phenomena, about the intangible to help many people, but they are very progressive in how they implement the concept of representation in their environment. So I began to study cultural practices in that field, in proxemics using phenomenology. And I began observing that the development of cultural practices are throughout the correspondence between circumstance and situation. So situations is circumstance is the first thing that is going on in your immediate environment, are the first objects you are going to use to generate or to create in that environment. And in that sense, objects and cultural practices where you identify or where you relate are going to be, first of all, are going to have an immediate impact towards many people. And then that circumstance is going to be ascribed to a situation. So if you're looking at if you're looking at this model, you're going to see that circumstance pertains to not only a moment that it can be organized in a progression or in a sense of production, but it can also evolve, it's in movement between situations. And your circumstance and my circumstance may be different, but they're gonna be ascribed towards a developing and evolving situation. So that is why intersections or intersectionalities are involved in that movement and that exchange or communication of different systems and way we do things. And in that sense, there's also a transversal aspect of it where causation is important. So first of all, when assessing the white paper number 2 or the conservation plan, I started to look how the Preservation Act uses material or conceptual integrity. So if you see, if you have read about John Ruskin in architecture, he talks about the integrity of material, and when this material decay, they're gonna be replaced. So at the end, are you gonna be having an integral building? Are you gonna be an authentic building? So that was another disparity I saw when we were talking about preservation, is that the concept of integrity or authenticity are, first of all, used exchangeably, and they're not only the same, but also what is what is authentic is a matter of discussion, and that is a really whole other conversation. But first of all, I'm going to talk about what is going on here. Foremost, to identify a historic place as such, integrity has been historically identified as an essential part of a historical building material expression. While materiality is physically expressed, integrity can be communicated through components in such a way can reproduce a perceived experience. Technology and virtual reality can aid such a venture. According to the form of how to apply the National Register criteria for evaluation, there are 7 aspects evaluated when identifying integrity: location, design, setting, materials, workmanship, sensation, and association. Through characterization as well as technology, we can identify, preserve, and reproduce up to 71% of the integrity of Oso Blanco as shown in Figure 2. So this is really important because it's going to be all about language and how we are going to be safeguarding how these objects or elements are perceived. So now with technology, to assume the definitions of integrity portrayed in the Preservation Act of 1966 and of the United States, we can reproduce, or we can generate a body of information that assumes that integrity when even the building does not exist. So by using virtual reality, we can reproduce much of the experiences, not in the many authentic definitions of used in most history, but indeed in many definitions that are used today. So the first thing is I allocated these elements and asked how we can reconstruct a building without a building or the body. This model I developed in my thesis, the one that I was taught. It is not used or was not used for the white paper number 2. It's very important I distinguish that. So this is me trying to explain what I'm talking here about a little bit. So when I identify the integral components for the white paper number 2, I also identify their relation with history, historical practices, and cultural practices. The conservation plan in terms of architecture, it is really how we are going to reproduce a sense of production from that building. So I identify 6 components within the experience of a place that is distinguished by history, environment, sociocultural manifestation of not only cultural practices, but many activities that shape the history of the place. Legal policy making, like I was saying, law is really important for a penitentiary system, but it's not only important for the penitentiary system, but how concept and language are being used and reproduced. The economy, and of course, the virtual and somatic experience to recreate most of what we're trying to build without a body. So you're gonna see that there is this girl walking within a diachronic organization of elements. And in this case, these elements are going to be here. What is history, environment, sociocultural, legal policymaking, economy, virtual somatic experience. But those things as individual circumstances in a movement or in a sense of production organization. And that's the idea, how we're going to be perceiving these spaces that are going to be building this body that does not have a body. And so we use this shape to reproduce how everything is going to be organized. My boss told me, why don't we use the the logo of the Puerto Rico Science, Technology, and Research Trust. And I think it was perfect because it has had 6 parts, so it was easily to use to organize. So I took the components: history, environment, sociocultural developments, legal policymaking, economy, virtual and somatic experience, and begin to mold the experience through time. So it's not only about cultural practices, it's about its temporality, because every circumstance, every particular circumstance is a product of its own moment, its own time. And of course, the technology that it's developed from it, because technology is a product of culture. So in that sense, in the first model at the left, we have the dispersion of components is realized by the relationship of historical interdependence, managed simply as past, present, future. And those topics, which can be assessed with prior connection of the past, along with its documented history, welcomes you to the space, to the overall space, and thus becoming a place. Topics which can immediately impact current social realities, such as economy and policy making, are at the center with the space market clinic. So what we thought is that you could be entering from the past and getting out of the building towards the future. And in that sense, we will be having the whole virtual reality somatic experience at the end and further economic developments. So it says here, spatial organization, space and functional relationships, space displacement aims to produce a circumstance where education, learning, and experimentation can be held. Spatial form is organized into zones where a relationship of forms and function produce a suggested spatial circulation that revolve in a central space organization upon space X. These functions may be dynamic, consistent, or traditional. And that in that sense, I made an organization of its dynamic evolvement or development in this space. You're gonna see if the spaces that are components that each circumstance in the development of space is more dynamic or is more consistent or is traditional, it's going to pinpoint you to various circumstances that are related in that manner. And well, we have education, learning, experimentation, organized in this sense. This is one of the tables used for the white paper. And when we're walking in the space, the idea is that you get a sense of motion in the space through the dynamics of relationality. And well, this is what I was talking to you about: spatial dynamics, about distribution and function. We organized in the white paper. I consulted this while I was writing it. I was consulting with my boss what needs does the space needed to have more than only the components that I was just describing. He talked to me in that moment about his idea of making a conservation lab and what it was going to be meaning in the sense of the economic development of the place. So integrating that knowledge, I generating more of a dynamic distribution, and this is how it turned out. So the future of heritage. Adam Groves are very innovative in the way they are not only talking about the function of heritage, but our responsibility towards it, about our responsibility of assessing the future as a resources. Modernity was very, very direct in its theoretical implementation of empty future, what they call empty futures, about the possibility of everything coming to be. So I guess it's more responsible to acknowledge that we're having a living future. We are responsible for what we can delegate towards our kids, our future, so in this sense, I like the definition they give with living future. It refers to halos of evolutionary potential that surround and permeate individuals and make it possible for them to transform other and be transformed by them in surprising and unintended ways. It is neither predetermined nor it's fully intermediate, empty, and open to endless transformation. Rather, it is an embedded future that possesses the still to be determined character of collective futures in the making. So this is why at the end of the building, I try to keep the story open to not only the necessities of our immediate moment, but future's necessities too. And thinking in that sense, it was really important, the element of education, given that education is essentially pinpointing, determining certain cultural practices that are going to be part of this heritage. Those are my references. Well, thank you very much. And I'm finishing with this sentence from Aristotle, of things under one idea, there is but one science. Of goods, there are many sciences. So start to think about the possibilities of heritage more than in the traditional sense. It is not only one. There is not only one way to look at practices. There are many achievable futures towards heritage, towards the environment, and towards each circumstance in particular. So thank you very much. I hope you have liked this presentation.
Thank you so much, Alitza. That was really, really interesting. And I have a bunch of questions, but we want to hear from our audience first. So we're just gonna jump right into our live Q&A. Let's go.